Preface of At Agincourt, Whitehoods of Paris, by G. A. Henty. The long and bloody feud between the houses of Orleans and Burgundy, which for many years devastated France, caused a prodigious destruction of life and property, and was not even relaxed in the presence of a common enemy. It is very fully recorded in the pages of Monstrelet and other contemporary historians. I have here only attempted to relate the events of the early portion of the struggle, from its commencement up to the astonishing victory of Agincourt, won by a handful of Englishmen over the chivalry of France. Here the two factions, with the exception of the Duke of Burgundy himself, laid aside their differences for the moment, only to renew them while France still lay prostrate at the feet of the English conqueror. At this distance of time, even with all the records at one's disposal, it is difficult to say which party was most to blame in this disastrous civil war, a war which did more to cripple the power of France than was ever accomplished by English arms. Unquestionably Burgundy was the first to enter upon the struggle, but the terrible vengeance taken by the Armagnacs, as the Orleanists came to be called, for the murders committed by the mob of Paris in alliance with him, was of almost unexampled atrocity in civil war, and was mainly responsible for the terrible acts of cruelty afterwards perpetrated upon each other by both parties. I hope some day to devote another volume to the story of the desperate and natural struggle. This from G. A. Henty. Chapter 1. "And is it true that our lord and lady sail next week for their estate in France?" "Ay, it's true enough, and more's the pity. 'Twas a sad day for us all when the king gave the hand of his ward, our lady, to his baron of Artois." "Oh, they say she was willing enough, Peter." "Ay, all say she loved him, and being a favourite with the queen, she got her to ask the king to accede to the knight's suit, and no wonder. He's as proper a man as eyes can want to look on, tall and stately, and they say brave. His father and grandfather both were Edward's men, and held their castle for us. His father was a great friend of the Black Prince, and he, too, took a wife from England. Since then things have not gone too well with us in France, and they say that our lord has had difficulty in keeping clear of the quarrels that are always going on, out there, between the great French lords, and seeing that we have but little power in Artois, he has to hold himself discreetly, and to keep aloof as far as he can from the strife there, and bide his time until the king sends an army to win back his own again. But I doubt not that, although our lady's wishes and the queen's favour may have gone some way with him, the king thought more of the advantage of keeping this French noble, whose fathers have always been faithful vassals of the crown, and who was himself English on his mother's side, faithful to us, ready for the time when the royal banner will flutter in the wind again, and blood will flow as it did at Crécy and Poitiers. The example of a good knight like Sir Eustace taking the field for us with his retainers might lead others to follow his example. Besides, there were several suitors for our lady's hand, and by giving her to this French baron there would be less offence and heart burning than if he had chosen from among her English suitors. And indeed I know not that we have suffered much from its being. It's true that our lord and lady live much on their estates abroad, but at least they are here part of their time, and their castellan does not press us more heavily during their absence than does our lord when at home." "He is a goodly knight, is Sir Aylmer, a just man and kindly, and being a cousin of our lady's, they do wisely and well in placing all things in his hands during their absence." "Ay, we have naught to grumble at, for we might have done worse if we had had an English lord to our master, who might have called us into the field when he chose, and have pressed us to the utmost of his rights whenever he needed money." The speakers were a man and a woman, who were standing looking on at a party of men practising at the butts on the village green of Summerley, one of the hamlets on the estates of Sir Eustace de Villeroy in Hampshire. "Well shot!" the man exclaimed, as an archer pierced a white wand at a distance of 80 yards. "Ah, they are good shots all, and if our lord and lady have fears of troubles in France, they do right well in taking a band of rare archers with them. There are but 25 of them, but they are all of the best. When they offered a prize here a month since for the bowmen of Hants and Sussex and Dorset, methought they had some good reason why they should give such high prizes as to bring hither the best men from all 3 counties, and we were all proud that 4 of our own men should have held their own so well in such company, and especially that Tom, the miller's son, should have beaten the best of them. He is captain of the band, you know, but almost all the others shoot nigh as well. There's not one of them who cannot send an arrow straight into the face of a foe at 120 yards. There were some others as good, who would fain have been of the party, but our lady said she would take no married men, and she's right. They go for 5 years, and that's certain, and methinks a man fights all the better when he knows there is no one in England praying for his return, and that if he falls there's no widow or children to bewail his loss. There are as many stout men at arms going too, so the castle of Villeroy will be a hard nut for anyone to crack, for I hear they can put 150 of their vassals there in the field. Ay, we shall miss Sir Aylmer's son Guy. He's ever down at the village green when there are sports going on. There's not one of his age who can send an arrow so straight to the mark, and not many of the men, and he can hold his own with a quarterstaff too. Ay, dame, he is a stout lad and a hearty one. They say that at the castle he's ever practising with arms, and that though scarce 16 he can wield a sword and heavy battle axe as well as any man at arms there. He is gentle too, the woman said. Since his mother's death he often comes down with wine and other goodies if anyone is ill, and he speaks as softly as a girl. There's not one of the estate but has a good word for him, nor doubts that he'll grow up as worthy a knight as his father, though gentler perhaps in his manner, and less grave in face, for he was ever a merry lad. Since the death of his lady mother 2 years ago he has gone about sadly. Still, of late, he's gotten over his loss somewhat, and he can laugh heartily again. I wonder his father can bear to part with him. Sir Eustace knows well enough that he cannot always keep the boy by his side, dame, and that if a falcon is to soar well he must try his wings easily and early. He goes as page, does he not? Ay, but more, methinks, as companion to young Henry, who has, they say, been sickly from a child, and, though better now, has scarce the making of a stalwart knight in him. His young brother Charles is a sturdy little chap, and bids fair to take after his father, and little Lady Agnes, who comes between them, is full of fire and spirit. Yes, methinks Guy will have a pleasant time of it out there, that is, if there are no fresh troubles. I doubt not that in 2 or 3 years he'll be one of our lord's esquires, and if he has a chance of displaying his courage and skill, may be back among us, a dubbed knight, before many years have passed over our heads. France is a rare place for gaining honours, and so it may well be, for I see not that we gain much else by our king's possessions there. Oh, there is plenty of spoil brought over after Crécy and Poitiers. Ay, but it soon goes, easy come, easy go, you know. And though they say that each man that fought there brought home a goodly share of spoil, I'll warrant me the best part went down their throats ere many months had passed. Ay, 'tis ever so, dame, but I agree with you, and deem that it would be better for England if we did not hold a foot of ground in France, and if English kings and nobles were content to live quietly among their people. We have spent more money than ever we made in these wars, and even were our kings to become, indeed, as they claim, kings of France as well as England, the ill would be much greater, as far as I can see, for us all. Still, there may be things, dame, that we country folk don't understand, and I suppose that it must be so, else Parliament would not be so willing to vote money always when the kings want it for wars with France. The wars in France don't affect us as much as those with Scotland and Wales. When our kings go to France to fight, they take with them only such as are willing to go, men at arms and archers, but when we have troubles such as took place but 5 or 6 years ago, when Douglas and Percy and the Welsh all joined against us, then the lords call out their vassals, and the sheriffs the militia of the county, and we have to go to fight willy-nilly. Our lord had 100 of us with him to fight for the king at Shrewsbury. Nigh 30 never came back again. That's worse than the French wars, dame. Don't I know it, for wasn't my second boy one of those who never came back? Ay, they'd better be fighting in France, perhaps, for that lets out the hot blood that might otherwise bring on fighting at home. That's so, dame. Things are all for the best, though one does not always see it. A week later, all the tenantry gathered in front of the castle to wish Godspeed to their lord and lady, and to watch the following by which they were accompanied. First there passed half a dozen mounted men at arms, who were to accompany the party but half a day's march, and then to return with Sir Aylmer. Next to these rode Sir Eustace and Lady Margaret, still a beautiful woman, a worthy mate for her noble looking husband. On her other side Sir Aylmer. Then came John Harpen, Sir Eustace's esquire, beside whom trotted Agnes, a bright merry faced girl of 12. Guy rode with the two boys. Then came 24 men at arms, many of whom had fought well and stoutly at Shrewsbury, while Tom, the miller's son, or, as he was generally called, Long Tom, strode along at the head of 24 bowmen, each of whom carried the long English bow and quiver full of cloth yard arrows, and in addition a heavy axe at his leathern girdle. Behind these were some servitors leading horses carrying provisions for the journey, and valises with the clothes of Sir Eustace, his wife, and children, and a heavy cart drawn by 4 strong horses, with the bundles of extra garments for the men at arms and the archers, and several large sheaves of spare arrows. The men at arms wore iron caps, as also breast and back pieces. On the shoulders and arms of their leathern jerkins iron rings were sewn thickly, forming a sort of chain armour, while permitting perfect freedom of the limbs. The archers also wore steel caps, which, like those of the men at arms, came low down on the neck and temples. They had on tough leathern frocks, girded in at the waist, and falling to the knee. Some of them had also iron rings sewn on the shoulders. English archers were often clad in green cloth, but Sir Eustace had furnished the garments, and had chosen leather, both as being far more durable, and as offering a certain amount of defence. The frocks were sleeveless, and each man wore cloth sleeves of a colour according to his fancy. The band was in all respects as well appointed one. As Sir Eustace wished to avoid exciting comment among his neighbours, he had abstained from taking a larger body of men, and it was partly for this reason that he had decided not to dress the archers in green. But every man had been carefully picked. The men at arms were all powerful fellows who had seen service. The archers were little inferior in physique, for strength as well as skill was required in archery, and in choosing the men Sir Eustace had, when there was no great difference in point of skill, selected the most powerful among those who were willing to take service with him. Guy enjoyed the 2 days' ride to Southampton greatly. It was the first time that he had been away from home, and his spirits were high at thus starting on a career that would, he hoped, bring him fame and honour. Henry and his brother and sister were also in good glee, although the journey was no novelty to them, for they had made it twice previously. Beyond liking change, as was natural at their age, they cared not whether they were at their English or at their French home, as they spoke both languages with equal fluency, and their life at one castle differed but little from that at the other. Embarking at Portsmouth in a ship that was carrying military stores to Calais, they coasted along the shores of Sussex and of Kent as far as Dungeness, and then made across to Calais. It was early in April, the weather was exceptionally favourable, and they encountered no rough seas whatever. On the way, Sir Eustace related to Guy and his sons the events that had taken place in France, and had led up to the civil war that was raging so furiously there. In 1392, the King of France being seized with madness, the Dukes of Burgundy and Orleans in a very short time wrested the power of the state from the hands of his faithful councillors, the Constable de Clisson, La Riviere, and others. De Clisson retired to his estate and castle at Montelary. The 2 others were seized and thrown into prison. De Clisson was prosecuted before Parliament as a false and wicked traitor, but the king, acting on the advice of Orleans, who had not then broken with the Dukes of Burgundy and Berry, had, after La Riviere and another had been in prison for a year, stopped the prosecution, and restored their estates to them. Until 1402 the Dukes of Burgundy and Berry were all powerful, and in 1396 a great number of knights and nobles, led by John, Count of Nevers, the eldest son of the Duke of Burgundy, went to the assistance of the King of Hungary, which country was being invaded by the Turks. They were, however, on the 28th of September, utterly defeated. The greater portion of them were killed. Nevers and the rest were ransomed and brought home. In 1402 the king, influenced by his wife Isabel and his brother the Duke of Orleans, who were on terms of the closest alliance, placed the entire government in the hands of the latter, the Duke of Orleans, who at once began to abuse it to such an extent, by imposing enormous taxes upon the clergy and the people, that he paved the way for the return of his uncle of Burgundy to power. On the 27th of April, 1404, Philip the Bold of Burgundy died. He was undoubtedly ambitious, but he was also valiant and able, and he had the good of France at heart. He was succeeded by his son John, called the Fearless, from the bravery that he had displayed in the unfortunate Hungarian campaign. The change was disastrous for France. John was violent and utterly unscrupulous, and capable of any deed to gratify either his passions, jealousies, or hatreds. At first he cloaked his designs against Orleans by an appearance of friendship, paid him a visit at his castle near Vincennes, where he was at the time lying ill. When he recovered, the two princes went to mass together, dined at their uncle's, the Duke of Berry, and together entered Paris, and the Parisians fondly hoped that there was an end of the rivalry that had done so much harm. It was, however, but a very short time afterwards that, on the 23rd of November, 1407, as the Duke of Orleans was returning from having dined with the Queen, and was riding with only 2 esquires and 4 or 5 men on foot carrying torches, 20 armed men sprang out from behind a house and rushed upon him. "I am the Duke of Orleans," the prince cried, but they hurled him from his mule, and as he tried to rise to his feet, one blow struck off the hand he raised to protect his head. Other blows rained down upon him from axe and sword, and in less than a minute the Duke of Orleans lay dead. The Duke of Burgundy at first affected grief and indignation, but at the council the next day he boldly avowed that Orleans had been killed by his orders. He at once took horse and rode to the frontier of Flanders, which he reached safely, though hotly chased by a party of the Duke of Orleans' knights. The duke's widow, who was in the country at the time, hastened up to Paris with her children and appealed for justice to the king, who declared that he regarded the deed done to his brother as done to himself. The Dukes of Berry and Bourbon, the constable and chancellor, all assured her that she should have justice. But there was no force that could hope to cope with that which Burgundy could bring in the field, and when, 2 months later, Burgundy entered Paris at the head of 1,000 men at arms, no attempt was made at resistance, and the murderer was received with acclamations by the fickle populace. The king at the time was suffering from one of his terrible fits of insanity, but a great assembly was held, at which princes, councillors, lords, doctors of law, and prominent citizens were present. A monk of the Cordeliers, named John Petit, then spoke for 5 hours in justification of the duke, and the result was that the poor insane king was induced to sign letters cancelling the penalty of the crime. For 4 months the duke remained absolute master of Paris, disposing of all posts and honours, and sparing no efforts to render himself popular with the burghers. A serious rebellion breaking out at Liege, and the troops sent against the town being repulsed, he was obliged to leave Paris to put down the revolt. As soon as he had left, the queen and the partisans of Orleans prepared to take advantage of his absence, and 2 months later Queen Isabel marched with the Dauphin, now some 13 years old, from Melun with 3,000 men. The Parisians received her with applause, and as soon as she had taken up her quarters at the Louvre, the Dukes of Berry, Bourbon, and Brittany, the constable, and all the great officers of the court rallied round her. 2 days later the Duchess of Orleans arrived with a long train of mourning coaches. A great assembly was held, and the king's advocate announced to them the intention of the king to confer the government upon the queen during his illness, and produced a document signed by the king to that effect. The Duchess of Orleans then came forward, and kneeling before the Dauphin, begged for justice for the death of her husband, and that she might be granted an opportunity of refuting the calumnies that John Petit had heaped on the memory of her husband. A week later another great assembly was held, and the justification of the duke was read, refuting all these imputations,
and the Duchess's advocate demanded that the Duke should be forced to make public reparation, and then to be exiled for 20 years. The Dauphin replied that he and all the princes of the blood royal present held that the charges against the Duke of Orleans had been amply refuted, and that the demands with reference to the Duke of Burgundy should be provided for in course of justice. Scarcely had the assembly broken up when it became known that Burgundy and his army was on their way back to Paris. Resistance was out of the question; therefore, taking the young Dauphin with her, and accompanied by all the members of the royal family, the queen retired to Tours. Burgundy, unscrupulous as he was, finding that although he might remain master of Paris, he could not hope to rule France except when acting under the pretence of the king's authority, soon sent an embassy to Tours to endeavour to arrange matters. He was able to effect this with the less difficulty that the Duchess of Orleans had just died from grief at her husband's death, and at the hopelessness of obtaining vengeance on his murderer. The queen was won to the cause of Burgundy by secret proposals submitted to her for a close league between them, and in March a treaty was concluded, and a meeting took place at Chartres, at which the duke, the king, the queen, the royal princes, and the young Duke of Orleans and his adherents were present. The king declared that he pardoned the duke, and the princes of Orleans consented to obey his orders and to lay aside all hatred and thoughts of vengeance, and shortly afterwards Paris welcomed with shouts of joy the return of the king and queen, and the apparent reconciliation of all parties. But again the truce was a brief one, for the princes and adherents of Orleans might bend before circumstances at the moment, but their feelings were unchanged. A head of the party was needed, and the young duke married the daughter of Count Bernard d'Armagnac, one of the most powerful and ambitious nobles of the south of France, who at once, in concert with the Dukes of Berri and Brittany and other lords, put himself at the head of the Orleans party. On the 10th of July, 1411, the three princes of Orleans sent a long letter to the king, complaining that no reparation whatever had been made for the murder of their father, and begging him that, as what was done at Chartres was contrary to every principle of law, equity, reason, and justice, the case should be reopened again. They also made complaints against the Duke of Burgundy for his conduct and abuse of power. As the king was surrounded by Burgundy's creatures, no favourable reply was returned, and a formal challenge or declaration of war was, on the 18th of July, sent by the princes to the Duke of Burgundy, and both parties began at once to make preparation for war. Now, from my own view of this quarrel, King Henry sent for me a year since, and asked for whom I should hold my castle if Orleans and Burgundy came to blows, adding that Burgundy would be viewed by him with most favour. "My father and grandfather ever fought faithfully in the service of England," I said, "but for years past now the line betwixt your Majesty's possessions and those of France has been drawn in, and my estates and castle of Villeroy now lie beyond the line, and I am therefore a vassal of France as well as of your Majesty. It being known to all men that even before I became Lord of Summerley, on my marriage with your Majesty's ward, Mistress Margaret, I, like my father, held myself to be the liege man of the King of England. I am therefore viewed with much hostility by my neighbours, and right gladly would they seize upon any excuse to lay complaint against me before the king, in order that I might be deprived of my fief and my castle. This I would fain hold always for your Majesty, and seeing how it is situated but a few miles across the border, it is, I would humbly submit to you, of importance to your Majesty that it should be held by one faithful to you, since its possession in the hands of an enemy would greatly hinder any English army marching out from Calais to the invasion of France. It is a place of some strength now, but were it in French hands it might be made very much stronger, and would cost much time and loss of men to besiege. At present your Majesty is in alliance with Burgundy, but none can say how the war will go, or what changes will take place, and should the Orleanists gain the upper hand, they will be quick to take advantage of my having fought for Burgundy, and would confiscate my estates and hand them over to one who might be hostile to England.
and pledged to make the castle a stronghold that would greatly hinder and bar the advance of an English army upon Paris. Therefore, sire, I would, not for my own sake, but for the sake of your Majesty's self and your successors, pray you to let me for a while remain quietly at Summerley until the course of events in France is determined." The king was pleased to see the force of what I urged. As far as I had inclinations in the case, if they were towards the cause, not of Burgundy himself, whose murder of Orleans was alike treacherous and indefensible, but of his cause, seeing that Flanders is wholly under his authority, and that in Artois he is well nigh paramount at present. On the other hand, Amiens and Ponthieu, which lie but a short distance to the south of me, are strongly Orleanist, and I have therefore every motive for standing aloof. So far the fortune of war has been so changeable that one cannot say that the chances incline toward one faction more than the other. Even the church has failed to bring about the end of the troubles. The Orleanists have been formally placed under interdicts and cursed by book, bell, and candle. The king's commands have been laid upon all to put aside their quarrels, but both the ban of the church and the king's commands have been ineffectual. I am as anxious as ever to abstain from taking any part in the trouble, the more so as the alliance between our king and Burgundy has cooled somewhat. But I have received such urgent prayers from my vassals at Villeroy to come among them, since they are now being plundered by both parties, that I feel it is time for me to take up my abode there. When the king stayed at Winchester a month since, I laid the matter before him. He was pleased to say that what I had urged a year ago had turned out to be as I had foretold, and that he would give me leave to go over and establish myself at Villeroy, and to hold myself aloof from both parties until the matter should further ripen. What will come of it I cannot say. The English king seemed to me to be ailing, and I fear that it may not be long before young Henry comes to the throne. He is a wild young prince, but has already shown himself in the northern war to be full of spirit and courage, and methinks that when he comes to the throne he will not long observe the peaceful policy of his father, but that we shall certainly see the royal standard once again spread to the winds of France. "But, Sir Eustace," Guy said when he had concluded, "how do these matters affect you? I thought that by the treaty that the west part of Artois was English." "Ay, lad, it was so settled, but at that time the strength of France had been broken at Poitiers, and the Black Prince and his army were so feared that his terms were willingly accepted in order to secure peace. Much has happened since then. War has been constantly going on, sometimes hotly, sometimes sluggishly. France has had her own troubles, and as the English kings have been more pacific, and England has become weary of bearing the heavy expenses of the war, the treaty has become a dead letter. Gascony, in which province Armagnac is the greatest lord, is altogether lost to England, as is the greater part of Guienne. A greater portion of the people there were always bitterly opposed to the change, and, as you know, even in the time of the Black Prince himself there were great rebellions and troubles. Since then town after town and castle after castle has declared for France, and no real efforts have ever been made by the English to win them back again. I, who in England am an English baron, and, so long as things go on as present, a French noble, while in France, am in a perilous position between my two suzerains. Were an English army to land I should join them, for I still hold myself to be a vassal of the King of England, as we have been for 3 generations. As to the French disputes, I fear that sooner or later I shall have to declare in favour of one party or the other, for it will be difficult to stand altogether aloof from these conflicts, because all men, at least all men of condition, are well nigh forced to take one side or the other. The plea that I am a baron of England will be of no avail, for both sides would turn against me, and be glad of an excuse for pillaging and confiscating my estate. At present, then, I must regard myself solely as a French noble, for Villeroy has passed into the hands of France, just as for a while it passed into the hands of England, and if this war goes on we shall have to take a side." "And to which side do your thoughts incline, Sir Eustace, if I may ask you?" "I love not either side, Guy, and would fain, if I could be so, that my sword should remain in its sheath. I fear that I shall have to go with Burgundy, for he is all powerful in Artois, but had I been altogether free to choose I should have sided with Orleans. In the first place, it is certain that the last duke was foully murdered by Burgundy, who therefore laid the foundation for the present troubles.
There were jealousies before, as there have always been between the great nobles, but that act forced almost all to take sides. The Dukes of Berri and Brittany, who had been of the party of the late Duke of Burgundy, were driven by his foul act of his son to range themselves with Orleans. Armagnac is very powerful in the south, Berri's dukedom is in the north, that of Orleans to the northeast. Burgundy's strength lies in his own dukedom, which has ever been all but independent of France, in Flanders, in Artois, and in Paris. Thus, generally, it is the north and east of France against the south and west. This is broadly the case, but in a civil war provinces and countships, neighbours, aye, and families become split up into factions, as interest or family ties, or the desire to increase an estate by annexing another next to it, may influence the minds of men. The Baron continued, "So long as it is but a war between the great dukes and princes of France, we smaller men may hope to hold aloof, but as it goes on and evil deeds are done on both sides, men's passions become heated, the spirit spreads until every man's hand is against his neighbour, and he who joins not against one or the other finds both ready to oppress and rob him. I should not have cared to bring out an English following with me had we been forced to march any distance through France, but as Villeroy is but a few miles from the frontier, and of that distance well nigh half is through my own estates, we can reach the castle almost unnoticed. Once there, the fact that I have strengthened my garrison will keep me from attack, for either party would be chary in attacking one who can defend himself stoutly. I was minded to leave your lady and the two younger children in England, but in truth she begged so hard to accompany me that I could not say her nay." The castle of Villeroy was somewhat larger than the one in which Guy had been born and brought up. The plan, however, was very similar. There was the central keep, but whereas at home this was the dwelling house of the family, it was here used as a storehouse, and the apartments of the count and countess were in the range of buildings that formed an inner court round the keep. In point of luxury the French were in advance of the English, and they had already begun to combine comfort with strength in their buildings. The apartments struck Guy as being wonderfully spacious in comparison to those with which he was accustomed. On the ground floor of one side of the square was the banqueting hall. Its walls were decorated with arms and armour. The joists that supported the floor above were carved, the windows large and spacious, for, looking as they did into the inner court, there was no occasion for their being mere loopholes. Above the banqueting hall was a room where Lady Margaret sat with her maids engaged in working at tapestry, where the priest gave such slight instruction as was then considered necessary to Agnes and Charles. Henry had already passed out of his hands. Next to this room was the knight's sleeping apartment, or closet as it was then called, a room which would now be considered of ridiculously straitened dimensions, and close to it were the still smaller closets of the children. Beyond were a series of guest chambers. Another side of the courtyard contained the apartments of the Castellan, Jean Bouvard, a sturdy soldier of long experience, and those of the other officers of the household. The other two sides were occupied by the chapel, the kitchens, and the offices of the servants and retainers. All these rooms were loopholed on the side looking into the outer court. This was considerably wider and more extensive than the one surrounding the keep. Here were the stables, storehouses for grain and forage, and a building just erected for the lodging of the English garrison. All these buildings stood against the outer wall, so that they would afford no shelter to an enemy who had obtained possession of the first defences and was making an attack against the second line. The outer wall was 12 feet in thickness and 30 feet above the court. Outside the height was considerably greater, as there was a moat faced with stone 15 feet deep entirely surrounding it, and containing 7 or 8 feet of water. Walls ran half across the outer court, and from the end of these light wooden bridges formed a communication with the wall of the inner court, so that in the event of the outer wall being stormed or the gates being carried by assault, the defenders could retire to the inner defences. The ends of these bridges rested upon irons projecting from the wall, and so arranged that they could be instantly withdrawn when the last of the defenders had crossed over, when the bridges would at once fall into the courtyard below. The inner wall was 12 feet higher than the outer one, and, like it, was provided with a crenellated battlement 4 feet high. There were projecting turrets at each corner, and one in the middle of each side. The keep rose 20 feet higher than the wall of the inner court. The lower portions of the cross walls of the outer court were carried on as far as the inner wall, thereby dividing the space into four. Strong gates gave communication from one to the other. Into these could be driven the cattle of the tenantry, and one of them contained a number of huts in which the tenants themselves would be lodged. The courtyard facing the entrance was the largest of the areas into which the space between the outer and inner walls was divided, extending the whole width between the outer walls. Here the military exercises were carried on. Along the wall, at each side of the gate, were a range of stables for the use of the horses of guests, with rooms over them for the use of their retainers. There was a strong exterior work defending the approach to the drawbridge on the other side of the moat, and in all respects the castle was well appointed, and to Guy it seemed almost impossible that it could be carried by assault, however numerous the foe.
Chapter 2. Troubles in France. As soon as it was heard that the lord and lady had returned, the vassals of Villeroy came in to pay their respects, and presents of fowl, game, and provisions of all kinds poured in. The table in the banqueting hall was bountifully spread, casks of wine broached, and all who came received entertainment. As French was still spoken a good deal at the English court and among the nobles and barons, and was considered part of the necessary education of all persons of gentle blood, Guy, who had always used it in his conversation with his father, had no difficulty in performing his duty of seeing that the wants of all who came were well attended to. In a few days guests of higher degree came in, the knights and barons of that part of the province. A few of these expressed surprise at the height of the sturdy men-at-arms and archers loitering about the courtyard. Sir Eustace always answered any remarks made on the subject by saying, "Yes, Dame Margaret and I thought that instead of keeping all our retainers doing nothing in our castle in England, where there is at present no use whatever for their services, we might as well bring a couple of score of them over here. I have no wish to take part in any of the troubles that seem likely to disturb France, but there is never any saying what may happen, and at any rate it costs no more to feed these men here than in England." The English archers and men-at-arms were well satisfied with their quarters and food, and were soon on good terms with their French associates. The garrison, before their arrival, had consisted of 50 men-at-arms, and although these had no means of communicating verbally with the new arrivals, they were not long in striking up such acquaintance as could be gained by friendly gestures and the clinking of wine cups. Their quarters were beside those of the English, and the whole of the men-at-arms daily performed their exercises in the courtyard together, under the command of the castellan, while the archers marched out across the drawbridge and practised shooting at some butts pitched there. To the French men-at-arms their performances appeared astounding. The French had never taken to archery, but the crossbow was in use among them, and half of the French men-at-arms had been trained in the use of this weapon, which was considered more valuable in the case of sieges than of warfare in the field. While they were able to send their bolts as far as the bowmen could shoot their arrows, there was no comparison whatever in point of accuracy, and the archers could discharge a score of arrows while the crossbowmen were winding up their weapons. "Pardieu, Master Page," Jean Bouvard said one day as he stood with Guy watching the shooting of the archers, "I no longer wonder at the way in which you English defeated us at Crécy and Poitiers. I have heard from my father, who fought at Poitiers, how terrible was the rain of arrows that was poured upon our knights when they charged up the hill against the English, but I had never thought that men could shoot with such skill and strength. It was but yesterday that I set my men-at-arms to try and bend one of these English bows, and not one of them could draw an arrow anywhere near the head with all their efforts, while these men seem to do so with greatest ease, and the speed with which they can shoot off arrow after arrow well nigh passes belief. That tall fellow who is their chief but now sent 20 arrows into a space no greater than a hand's breadth, and at 120 yards, and that so quickly that he scarce seemed to take time to aim at all, and the others are well nigh as skilful. Yesterday I put up a breastplate such as is worn by our men-at-arms, and asked them to shoot at it at 80 yards. They fired a volley together at it. It was riddled like a colander. Not one of the 25 arrows had failed to pierce it." "Ay, at that distance, Captain, an English archer of fair skill could not miss it, and it needs Milan armour, and that of the best, to keep out their arrows." "By Our Lady," the captain remarked, "I would be sorry to attack a castle defended by them, and our lord has done well indeed to bring them over with him. Your men at arms are stalwart fellows. My own men feel well nigh abashed when they see how these men take up a stone that they themselves can with difficulty lift from the ground and hurl it 20 yards away, and they whirl their heavy axes round their heads as if they were reeds." "They are all picked men," Guy said with a laugh. "You must not take it that all Englishmen are of equal strength, though no doubt Sir Eustace would have gathered 500 as strong had he wished it." "If that be so," the captain said, "I can well believe that if France and England meet again on a field of battle, France shall be beaten as she was before. However, there is one comfort, we shall not be among the defeated, for our lord and his father and his grandfather before him have ever been with England, and Sir Eustace, having an English wife and mother, and being a vassal of the English crown for his estates in England, will assuredly take their part in case of a quarrel. Of course, at present we hold ourselves to be neutrals, and though our lord's leanings towards England give some umbrage to his neighbours, their enmity finds no expression, since for years now there has been no writing to speak of between the two nations. How it will be if Orleans and Burgundy come to blows I know not, but if they do so, methinks our lord will have to declare for one or the other, or he may have both upon him. A man with broad estates, on which many cast covetous eyes, can scarce stand altogether aloof. However, if Villeroy is attacked, methinks that with the following Sir Eustace has brought with him across the sea, even Burgundy himself will find that it would cost him so dearly to capture the castle that it were best left alone." And as Guy asked, "How about the vassals?" "They will fight for their lord," Jean Bouvard answered confidently. "You see, their fathers and grandfathers fought under the Black Prince, and it is natural that their leanings should be on that side. Then they know that there is no better lord in all Artois than St. Eustace, and his dame has made herself much beloved among them all. There is no fear that they will disobey our lord's orders whatever they be, and will fight as he bids them, for Orleans or Burgundy, England or France. He has never exercised to the full his rights of seigneur, he has never called upon them for their full quota of work. No man has even been hung on his estates for 2 generations, save for crime committed. No vassal's daughter has ever been carried into the castle. I tell you there is not a man for over 50 miles round who does not envy the vassals of Villeroy, and this would be a happy land indeed were all lords like ours. Were we to hoist the flag on the keep and fire a gun, every man on the estate would muster here before sunset, and would march against the King of France himself, did Sir Eustace order them to do so." "In that case, what force could we put on the walls, Captain?" 200 men beside the garrison, and we have provisions stored away in the keep sufficient for them and their women and children for a 3-months' siege. Sir Eustace gave me orders yesterday to procure wood of the kind used for arrows, and to lay in a great store of it, also to set the smiths to work to make arrowheads. I asked him how many, and he said, 'Let them go on at it until further orders. I should like a store sufficient at least for 100 rounds for each of these English archers, and if we had trouble, that it would be all the better. They can make their own arrows if they have suitable wood.' It seemed to me that 200 rounds was beyond all necessity, but how, when I see that these men can shoot nigh 20 rounds in a minute, I can well understand that a great supply for them is needful." The time passed very pleasantly at Villeroy. Sometimes Guy rode with his lord and lady when they went out hawking, or paid visits to neighbouring castles. Regularly every day they practised for 2 hours at arms, and although well instructed before, Guy gained much additional skill from the teaching of Jean Bouvard, who was a famous swordsman. The latter was surprised at finding that the page was able to draw the English bows as well as the archers, and that, although inferior to Long Tom and 3 or 4 of the best shots, he was quite as good a marksman as the majority. Moreover, though of gentle blood, he would join with the men in their bouts of quarterstaff, and took no more heed of a broken head than they did. "Pardieu, Master Page," he said one day when Guy came in from the courtyard to have his head, which was streaming with blood, bound up, "our French pages would marvel indeed if they saw you. They all practise in arms as you do, save with the shooting, but they would consider it would demean them sorely to join in such rough sports with their inferiors, or to run the risk of getting their beauty spoiled by a rough blow. No wonder your knights strike so mightily in battle when they are accustomed to striking so heavily in sport. I saw one of your men at arms yesterday bury his axe to the very head in a block of oak. He wagered a stoup of wine that no 2 of my men at arms would get the axe out, and he won fairly, for indeed it took 4 of the knaves at the handle to tug it out, and then indeed it needed all their strength.
No armour ever forged could have withstood such a blow. It would have cracked both the casque and the skull inside like egg shells. It seems to me that 1,000 such men, with as many archers, could march through France from end to end if they kept well together, and were well supplied with meat and drink by the way. They'd need that, for they are as good trenchermen as they are fighters, and indeed each man amongst them eats as much as 3 of my fellows." "Yes, they want to be well fed," Guy laughed, "and they are very pleased with the provision that you make for them. Surely not one of them ever fed so well before." "Food does not cost much," the captain said. "We have herds of our own which run half wild on the low ground near the river, which our lords always keep in hand for their own uses, and they multiply so fast that they are all the better for thinning. We sell a few occasionally, but they are so wild that it scarce pays the trouble of driving them to the nearest market, and we are always ready to grant permission to any of the vassals whose cattle have not done as well as usual to go out and kill one or two for meat." "I hear from the Governor of Calais," Sir Eustace said, when he returned from a visit to that town, "that a truce has been agreed upon between England and France for a year. It is France who asked for it, I suppose. Both parties here wanted to be able to fight it out without interference. Here in Artois, where the Burgundians are most numerous, they will profit, as they will have no fear of England trying to regain some of her lost territory, while in the south it will leave Armagnac and his friends equally free from English incursions from Guienne." "And how will it affect us, Eustace?" his wife asked. "That I have not been able fully to determine. At any rate, they will have no excuse for attacking us upon the ground that we are partly English, and wholly so in feeling; but upon the other hand, if we are attacked either by Burgundians or Orleanists, we cannot hope, as we should have done before, for aid from Calais, lying as we do some 15 miles beyond the frontier. Amiens has already declared for Burgundy, in spite of the fact that a royal proclamation has been issued and sent to every town and bailiwick throughout France, strictly commanding all persons whatsoever not to interfere, or in any manner to assist the Dukes of Orleans or Burgundy in their quarrels with each other. I hear that the Duke of Burgundy has seized Roye, Nesle, and Ham, and a number of other places, and that both parties are fortifying all their towns. They say, too, that there is news that the king has again been seized with one of his fits of madness. However, that matters little. He has of late been a tool in the hands of Burgundy, and the royal signature has no weight one way or the other. However, now that hostilities have begun, we must lose no time, for at any moment one party or the other may make a sudden attack upon us. Burgundy and Orleans may quarrel, but it is not for love of one or the other that most of the nobles will join in the fray, but merely because it offers them an opportunity for pillaging and plundering, and for paying off old scores against the neighbours. Guy, bid John Harpen come hither." When the esquire entered, Sir Eustace went on: "Take 2 men at arms, John, and ride round to all the tenants. Warn them that there are plundering bands about, and that either the Burgundians or the Orleanists may swoop down upon us any day. Tell them that they had better send in here all their valuables, and at any rate the best of their cattle and horses, and to have everything prepared for bringing in their wives and families and the rest of their herds at a moment's notice. You can say that if they like they can at once send their wives and families in, with such store of grain and forage as they can transport, the more the better. If the plunderers come, so much the more is saved from destruction. If we are besieged, so much the more food have we here. Those who do not send in their families would do well to keep a cart with 2 strong horses ready day and night, so that no time would be lost when they get the signal. We shall fire a gun, hoist the flag, and light a bonfire on the keep, so that they may see the smoke by day or the fire by night. Tell Jean Bouvard to come to me. There is trouble afoot, Jean, and at any moment we may be attacked. Place 2 men at arms on each of the roads to St. Omer, St. Pol, and Bethune. Post them yourself at the highest points you can find near our boundary. By each have a pile of faggots well smeared with pitch, and have another pile ready on the keep, and a watch always stationed there. He is to light it at once when he sees smoke or fire from either of the 3 points. Let the men at the outposts be relieved every 4 hours. They must, of course, be mounted. Let one of the 2 remain by the faggots, and let the other ride 3 or 4 miles in advance, and so post himself to see a long distance down the road. If he sees a force advancing, he must gallop back at full speed to his comrade and light the fire. Have a gun always loaded on the keep, and have a brazier burning hard by with an iron in it, so that the piece may be fired the instant smoke is seen. It might be 2 or 3 minutes before the beacon would give out smoke enough to be noticed, and every minute may be of the greatest importance to the vassals. As soon as you return from setting the posts, see that everything is in readiness here. I myself will make sure that the drawbridge works easily and the portcullis runs freely in its groove. I have already sent off John Harpen to warn the tenants, and doubtless many of them will be in this afternoon. Send Pierre with 4 men and tell them to drive up a number of the cattle from the marshes. They need not trouble to hunt them all up today. Let them bring the principal herd. The others we will fetch in tomorrow, or let them range where they are until we have further news." In a few minutes the castle resounded with the din of preparations under the superintendence of Sir Eustace. The men-at-arms and archers carried up stones from the great pile that had been collected in the courtyard in readiness, to the various points on the walls that would be most exposed to assault. Others were employed in fixing barricades in the courtyard at the rear for the reception of the herd of half-wild cattle. The water was turned from the little rivulet running down to the Somme into the moat. 2 or 3 bullocks were killed to furnish food for the fugitives who might come in, and straw was laid down thickly in the sheds that would be occupied by them. Machines for casting heavy stones were taken from the storehouse and carried up to the walls and set up there. Large stone troughs placed in the courtyard were filled with water, and before nightfall everything was in readiness. As Sir Eustace had anticipated, most of the vassals whose farms lay at a distance from the castle came in with their wives and families in the course of the afternoon, bringing with them carts laden with their household goods, and a considerable number of horses and cattle. Lady Margaret herself saw that they were established as comfortably as possible in the sheds, which were large enough to contain all the women and children on the estate. As for the men, no such provision was necessary, as at this time of the year they could sleep in the open air. Guy was busy all day, seeing that the orders of his lord were carried out, and especially watching the operations of putting the ballistas and catapults together on the walls. Cannon, though now in use, had by no means superseded these machines, for they were cumbrous and clumsy and could only be fired at considerable intervals, and their aim was by no means accurate or their range extensive, as the charge of powder that could be used in them was comparatively small, and the powder itself ill made and defective in strength. Guy was struck with the difference of demeanour between the men-at-arms and archers, especially among the English contingent and that of the fugitives who poured in. What was a terrible blow to the latter was the cause of a scarce concealed gratification among the former. The 2 months that had been spent at the castle had to the English been a somewhat monotonous time, and the prospect of active service and of the giving and taking of blows made their blood course more rapidly through their veins. It was the prospect of fighting rather than of pay that had attracted them to the service of Sir Eustace. Then, as for a century previous, and until quite modern days, Frenchmen were regarded as the natural foes of England, and however large a force an English king wished to collect for service in France, he had never any difficulty whatever in obtaining the number he asked for, and they were ready cheerfully to give battle whatever the odds against them. The English archer's confidence in himself and his skill was indeed supreme. Before the shafts of his forefathers the flower of the French chivalry had gone down like rushes before a scythe, and from being a mere accessory to a battle, the English archers had become the backbone of the force. Their skill, in fact, had revolutionized warfare, had broken the power of cavalry, and had added to the dignity and value of infantry, who had become, as they had ever since continued to be, the prime factor in warfare. Consequently, the English archers and men-at-arms went about their work of preparation with a zest and cheerfulness that showed their satisfaction in it. "Why, Tom," Guy said to the tall leader of the archers, "you look as pleased as if it were a feast rather than a fray for which you were preparing." "And so I feel, Master Guy, for what have I been practising with the bow since I was 8 years old, but that I might, when the time came, send an arrow straight through the bars of a French visor. In faith, I began to think that I should never have an opportunity of exercising my skill on anything more worthy than a target or peeled wand. Since our kings have given up leading armies across the sea, there was no way but to take service with our lord when I heard that he wanted a small company of archers for the defence of his castle over here. And since we have come, it seemed to us all that we were taking pay and food under false pretences,
and that we might as well have stopped at home, where at least we can compete in all honour and good temper against men as good as ourselves, and with the certainty of winning a few silver pennies, to say nothing of plaudits from the onlookers. 'Tis with our people as with the knights of old. If they win in a tournament, they take the armour of the vanquished, and the prize from the Queen of Beauty, and many a glance of admiration from bright eyes. It is the same with us, for there is not an English maid but would choose an archer who stands straight and firm, and can carry off a prize when in good company, to a hind who thinks of naught but delving the soil and tending the herd." Guy laughed. "I suppose it is the same when you put it so, Long Tom, but there will be none of your English maids to watch your prowess here." "No, Master Guy, but here we shall fight for our own satisfaction, and prove to ourselves that we are as good men as our fathers were. I know naught of this quarrel. Had Sir Eustace taken us into the field to fight for one or another of these factions concerning which we know nothing, we should doubtless have done our duty and fought manfully; but we are all glad that here we are doing what we came for. We are going to defend the castle against Frenchmen of some sort or another, who would do ill to our lord and lady, and we shall fight right heartily and joyfully, and should still do so were it the mad King of France himself who marched against us. Besides, master, we should be less than men if we did not feel for the frightened women and children, who, having done no wrong and caring naught for these factions, are forced to flee from their homes for their lives. So we shall strike in just as we would strike in were we to come upon a band of robbers ill treating a woman at home. Think you that they will come, master?" he added eagerly. "That I cannot say surely, Tom, but Sir Eustace has news that the Burgundians have already seized several towns and placed garrisons there, and that armed bands are traversing the country burning and pillaging. Whether they will feel strong enough to make an attack on this castle I know not, but belike they will do so, for Sir Eustace, belonging as he does, and his fathers have done before him, to the English party, neither of the others will feel any goodwill toward him, and some of his neighbours may be well glad to take advantage of this troubled time to endeavour to despoil him of his castle and his possessions." "Well, they will want to have a good teeth to crack this nut, Master Guy, good teeth and strong, and methinks that those who come to pluck the feathers may well go back without their own. We have a rare store of shafts ready, and they will find that their crossbowmen are of little use against picked English archers, even though there be but 25 of us in all." "You know very well, Long Tom, that you have come over here whether there was any chance of your drawing your bow on a Frenchman or not." "Ay, that's true enough, Master Guy. Our lady wanted some bowmen, and I, who have been born and bred on the estate, was of course bound to go with her. Then you see, Master Guy, haven't I taught you to use the bow and the quarterstaff, and carried you on my shoulder many a score of time when you were a little lad and I was a big boy? It would not have been natural for you to have gone out with a chance of getting into a fight without my being there to draw a shaft when you needed it. Why, Ruth Gregory, whose sworn bachelor you know I am, would have cried shame on me if I had lingered behind. I told her that if I stayed it would be for her sake, and you should have seen how she flouted me, saying she'd have no tall lout hiding behind her petticoats, and if I stayed it should not be as her man. And now I must be off to my supper, or I shall find that there is not a morsel left for me." The gates of the castle were closed that night, but it was not considered necessary to lower the drawbridge. 2 sentries were posted at the work beyond the moat, and one above the gate, beside the watcher at the top of the keep. The next day things were got into better order. More barricades were erected for the separation of the cattle, a portion was set aside for horses. The provisions brought in from the farms were stored away in the magazines. The women and children began to settle down more comfortably in their sheds. The best of the horses and cattle were removed into the inner courtyard. The boys were set drawing water and filling the troughs, while some of the farm men were told off to carry the fodder to the animals, most of which, however, were for the time turned out to graze near the castle. Many of the men who had come in had returned to their work on the farms. During the day wagons continued to arrive with stores of grain and forage. Boys and girls drove in flocks of geese and turkeys and large numbers of ducks and hens, until the yard in which the sheds were was crowded with them. By nightfall every preparation was complete, and even Jean Bouvard himself could find nothing further to suggest. "If they are coming," he said to Sir Eustace, "the sooner they come the better, my lord. We have done all that we can do, and had best get it over with without more ado." "I still hope that no one will come, Bouvard, but I agree with you.
that if it is to come, the sooner the better. But there is no saying, it may be tomorrow, it may be months before we are disturbed. Still, in a war like this, it is likely that all will try and get as much as they can as quickly as possible, for at any moment it may suit Burgundy and Orleans to patch up their quarrel again. Burgundy is astute and cunning, and if he sees that the Orleans princes with Armagnac and the Duke of Bourbon are likely to get the best of it, he will use the king and queen to intervene and stop the fighting. Seeing that this may be so, the rogues who have their eye on their neighbours' goods and possessions will, you may be sure, lose no time in stretching out their hands for them." And a week later came the news that Sir Clunet de Brabant, who styled himself Admiral of France, had gathered 2,000 men from the Orleanist garrison, and with scaling ladders and other warlike machines had attacked the town of Rethel. The inhabitants had, however, notice of their coming, and resisted so stoutly that the Orleanists had been forced to retreat, and had then divided into two parties, each of whom had scoured the country, making prisoners all whom they met, firing the villages and driving off the cattle, and then returned to the town of Ham and to the various garrisons from which they had been drawn. Some of the tenants had returned to their farms, but when the news spread they again took refuge in the castle. It was probable that Artois, where almost all the towns were held by the Burgundian party, would be the next object of attack. The Orleanists remained quiet for 8 days only. Then the news came that they had moved out again from Ham, 8,000 strong, and were marching west. 2 days later several fugitives from the country round arrived at the castle, with news that the Orleanists were advancing against Bapaume, and the next morning they heard that they had, after a fierce fight, won their way to the gate of the town. The Burgundian garrison had then sallied out, and at first met with success, but had been obliged to retreat within the walls again. The Orleanists, however, considering the place too strong to be captured without a long siege, which might be interrupted by a Burgundian force from Flanders, had drawn off from the place, but were still marching north, burning and plundering. "It is likely enough that they will come this way," Sir Eustace said as he and Jean Bouvard had talked the matter over. "Assuredly Arras will be too strong for them to attempt. The straight line would take them to St. Pol, but the castle there is very strong also. They may sack and burn Auvergne and Auvigny, and then, avoiding both St. Pol and Arras, march between them to Pernes, which is large enough to give them much plunder, but has no force that could resist them. As Pernes is but 4 miles away, their next call may be here." "But why should they attack us, Sir Eustace? For here too they might reckon upon more hard labour than plunder." "It will depend upon whom they have with them," Sir Eustace replied. "They say that our neighbour Hugh de Fruges went south 10 days ago to join the Duke of Bourbon. His castle is but a small place, and as most of Artois is Burgundian, he might be afraid he might be captured. He has never borne me good will, and might well persuade the duke that were my castle and estates in his possession he might do good service to the cause, and that, moreover, standing as we do within 12 miles of the English frontier, its possession might be very valuable to him should the Orleanists ever have occasion to call in the aid of England, or to oppose their advance should the Burgundians take that step." "Surely neither of these factions will do that, Sir Eustace." "Why not, Bouvard? Every time the English armies have passed into France they have done it at the invitation of French nobles who have embroiled themselves with their kings. Burgundy and Orleans, Bourbon and Brittany, each fights for his own land and cares little for France as a whole. They may be vassals of the Valois, but they regard themselves as being nearly, if not altogether, their equals, and are always ready to league themselves with each other, or, if needs be, with the English against the throne." At 9 o'clock on the following evening Sir Eustace and his family were startled by the report of the gun on the keep, and running out saw the signal fire beginning to blaze up. "Above there!" Sir Eustace shouted. "Where is the alarm?" "A fire has just blazed up on the road to St. Pol," the warder replied. "Blow your horn, then, loudly and urgently." The news that the Orleanists were marching north from Bapaume had caused the greater portion of the farmers to come in on the previous day, and in a short time those who were nearest to the castle, and who had consequently delayed as long as possible, began to arrive. The garrison were already under arms, and had taken the places assigned to them on the walls. All the tenants had brought their arms in with them, and were now drawn up in the courtyard, where a large bonfire that had been for some days in readiness was now blazing. The newcomers, after turning their horses into the inclosure with those already there, joined them. All had been acquainted with the share that they were to bear should the place be besieged. They were to be divided into two parties, one of which was to be on duty on the walls with the garrison, the other to be held in reserve, and was, every 6 hours when matters were quiet, to relieve the party on the walls, or, when an attack took place, to be under arms and ready to hasten to any spot where its aid was required. The men were now inspected by Sir Eustace, additional arms were served out from the armoury to those whose equipment was insufficient, and they were then dismissed to join their wives and families until called to the walls. Chapter 3. A Siege. The two men who had lit the alarm fires had already ridden in. They reported that they had, just as it became dark, seen flames rising from a village 3 miles from them, and that the man in advance had ridden forward until near enough to see that a great body of men were issuing from the village in the direction of the castle. 10 of the English men at arms and as many French were now posted in the outwork at the head of the drawbridge under the command of Jean Bouvard. Sir Eustace placed himself with his squire on the wall above the gate, and 4 men were stationed at the chains of the drawbridge in readiness to hoist it should the order be given. The English archers were on the wall beside Sir Eustace, as their arrows commanded the ground beyond the outwork. Half an hour after the first alarm was given, the tale of the tenants was found to be complete, and the guards on the other 2 roads had also ridden in. Guy, to his great satisfaction, had been ordered by Sir Eustace to don his armour and to take his place beside him. It was upwards of an hour before a body of horsemen could be heard approaching. They came at a leisurely pace, for the bonfire on the road and that on the keep had apprised them that their hope of taking the castle by surprise had been frustrated by the disobedience of some of their men, who, in defiance of the strictest orders to the contrary, had set fire to several houses in the village after having plundered them. Sir Eustace, accompanied by his esquire and Guy, descended from the wall and crossed the drawbridge to the outwork. As soon as the horsemen came within bowshot of the castle, they lighted some torches, and 3 knights, preceded by a trooper carrying a white flag, and 2 others with torches, came towards the work. When within 50 yards of the postern they halted. "Is Sir Eustace de Villeroy present?" "I am here," Sir Eustace replied, and at his order 2 men with torches took their place, 1 on each side of him. "Who are you that approach my castle in armed force?" "I am Sir Clugnet de Brabant, Admiral of France. These are Sir Menessier Juiret and Sir Hugh de Fruges, and we come in the name of the Duke of Orleans to summon you to admit a garrison of his Highness's troops." "I am neither for Orleans nor for Burgundy," Sir Eustace replied. "I am a simple knight, holding my castle and estate as a vassal of the crown, and am ready to obey the orders of the king, and of him only when he is in condition of mind to give such orders. Until then I shall hold my castle, and will admit no garrison, whether of Orleans or of Burgundy." "We hold you to be a false vassal of the crown, and we are told that at heart you are an enemy to France and devoted to England." "I am a vassal of England for the estates of my wife in that country," Sir Eustace said, "and as at present there is a truce between the 2 nations, I can serve here the King of France as faithfully as if, in England, I should serve the King of England." "Nevertheless, Sir Eustace, you will have to receive a garrison of Orleans. I have at my back 8,000 men, and if you compel me to storm this hold of yours, I warn you that all within its walls will be put to the sword." "Thank you for your warning, Sir Knight, and I on my part warn you that 8,000 though you be, I shall resist you to the death, and that you will not carry 8,000 away. As for Sir Hugh de Fruges, I give him my open defiance. I know it is to him that I owe this raid, and if he be man enough, I challenge him to meet me in the morning on fair ground outside this postern, with lance and battle axe, to fight to the death. If he conquers, my castle shall be surrendered to him, upon promise of good treatment and a safe conduct to depart where all that offer in it. But if I slay him, you must give me your knightly oath that you and your following will depart forthwith." "The conditions could be hardly fair, Sir Eustace," Sir Clugnet said,
and though I doubt not that Sir Hugh would gladly accept them, I cannot permit him to do so. I have brought some 8,000 men here to capture this castle and hold it for the Duke of Orleans, and I see not why I should march away with them because you may perchance prove a better fighter than Sir Hugh. I am ready, however, to give a safe conduct to all within the walls, if you will surrender." "That I will not do, Sir Clugnet. I hold this castle neither for Burgundy nor Orleans, and am ready to give pledge that I will not draw sword for either of these princes, but if that will not content you, you must even take my castle if you can, and I give you fair warning that it will cost you dear." "Then adieu, Sir Knight, until tomorrow morning, when we will talk in another fashion." "So be it," Sir Eustace replied. "You will not find me backward in returning any courtesies you may pay me." The knights turned away with their torch bearers. "Keep a close watch tonight, Bouvard," Sir Eustace said. "Mark you what the knight said. Adieu till the morning. Had I to deal with a loyal gentleman I could have slept soundly, but with these adventurers it is different. It may be that he truly does not intend to attack till morning, but it is more likely that he used the words in order to throw us off our guard." "We will keep close ward, Sir Eustace. All the men at arms have their crossbows, and though I say not that they can shoot like these English archers, they can shoot straight enough to do good work should those fellows attempt in force to cross the small moat and attack the gate. But if they come, methinks it will be but to try if we are wakeful. 'Tis not a light thing to attack even an outwork like this, and with this loop from the moat surrounding it, without previous examination of the ground and reconnoitring of the castle." "They would not attempt to attack the fortress itself," Sir Eustace said, "but if they could seize this outwork by surprise it would mightily aid them in their attack on the fortress. At any rate I will send down 5 archers, and if any of the enemy crawl up to see how wide the water is here, and how the attempt had best be made, I warrant that they will not return if the archers can but get a sight of them. Post half your men on the wall and let the others sleep. Change them every 2 hours. We want no sleepy heads in the morning." By this time the confused sound of a large number of men marching could be made out, and a quarter of an hour later 3 or 4 cottages, some 500 yards away, were fired, and an angry murmur broke from the men as the flames shot up. After sending down the 5 archers, Sir Eustace returned to his post over the main gate. "Get cressets and torches in readiness to light if they attack the postern," Sir Eustace said. "We must have light to see how things go, so that we may hoist the drawbridge as soon as our men are upon it, should the enemy get the better of them. Be sure that one is not left behind. It were better that half a dozen of the enemy set foot on the drawbridge than that one of our brave fellows should be sacrificed." "I should think there is no fear of their attacking until those flames are burned down. We should see them against the light," John Harpen said. "No, there is no fear of their attacking, but the fire would be of advantage if any man were crawling up to spy. Of course they would not cross the slope in a line with the fire, but would work along on either side, reckoning, and with reason, that our men would have the light in their eyes. They would be all the less likely to make out objects crawling along in the shade by the side of the moat. Plant half a dozen bowmen at intervals on the wall, Tom, and tell them to keep a shrewd eye on the ground near the moat, and if they see aught moving there to try it with an arrow." There was shouting and noise up by the burning cottages, where the enemy were feasting on the spoils they had taken, and drinking from the wine barrels that had been brought with them in carts from the last village that they had plundered. "I wish we were somewhat stronger, or they somewhat weaker," Sir Eustace said. "Were it so, we would make a sally and give the knaves a sharp lesson, but with only 200 men against their 8,000 it would be madness to try it. We might slay a good many, but might lose a score before we were back in the castle, and it would be a heavy loss to us." "I was thinking that myself, Sir Eustace," his esquire said. "That is the worst of being on the defence. One sees such chances, but cannot avail oneself of them." In the castle everything was quiet, and all those not on duty were already asleep. Along the wall watchers stood at short intervals peering into the darkness, but the main body there were also stretched on the wall with their arms by their side until required to be up and doing. Now that Sir Eustace was himself at the gate, his esquire went round the walls at short intervals to be sure that the men on watch were vigilant. Presently a loud cry was heard from the corner of the moat away to the right. "Go and see what is doing, Guy," Sir Eustace said, "and bring me news." Guy ran along to the angle of the wall. Here one of the archers was posted. "What is it, Dickon?" "A man crept up to that corner opposite, Master Guy. I could not have sworn to him, or so pesky dark, but I thought there was something moving there, and shot almost at a venture, for I could scarcely see the end of my arrow, but it hit there or thereabouts, for I heard him shout. A moment later he was on his feet and running. I could see him more plainly then, so I shot again, and over he went. I fancy that in the morning you will see my arrow sticking up somewhere between his shoulder blades, though there is no saying precisely, for a nicety of shooting is not to be looked for in the dark." "You have done very well, Dickon. Keep your eyes open. We may be sure there are more than one of these fellows about." Guy hurried back with the news. "That is good," said Sir Eustace, "and it was just as well that the archer did not kill him outright with his first arrow. The cry will show any of his comrades who may be about that they had best keep their distance from the walls." A minute's silence followed, and then Long Tom said, "There is another has had his lesson, Sir Eustace. I heard a bow twang across there, and as there was no cry, you may be sure that the shaft sped straight, and that the man had no time to utter one." "He may have been missed altogether, Tom." "Missed altogether? No, indeed, Sir Eustace. There is no fear of that. There is not one of the men on the wall who would miss a man whose figure he could make out 50 yards distant, and they would scarce see them until they were as close as that. No, my lord, I would wager a month's pay that when morning dawns there is a dead man lying somewhere in front of the outwork." "Now, Guy, you had best go up to your room and lie down until daylight," Sir Eustace said. "There will be naught doing tonight, and unless I am mistaken we shall be busy from sunrise until sunset. I shall myself lie down for a couple of hours presently, and then send John Harp in to rest until daylight. Long Tom, see that you yourself and all your men take a short sleep by turns. We shall need your eyes to be open above all others tomorrow." Guy promptly obeyed the order. Dame Margaret was still up. "Is everything quiet, Guy?" she asked as she entered. "So quiet, my lady, that Sir Eustace has ordered me to bed, and he said that he himself should come down for a short sleep presently. 2 spies who crawled up have been slain by the archers. Sir Eustace is sure that no attack will be made before morning." Then he went into his little room and threw himself onto his pallet. During the first few minutes he lifted his head several times, fancying that he heard noises, then he fell into a sound sleep and did not awake until the day dawned. In a few minutes Guy was on the wall. The night had passed quietly. So far as was known, no fresh attempt at reconnoitring the works had been made, and as the moon had risen short after he had gone to bed, there was reason to believe that the fact that the 2 spies had not returned was so strong a proof of the vigilance of the garrison that the enemy had been content to wait until morning. Just as the sun rose, the 3 knights who had summoned the castle on the preceding evening appeared on the brow of the opposite slope, accompanied by a body of men at arms, and rode slowly round the castle. From time to time they halted, and were evidently engaged in a discussion as to the point at which it could be best attacked. "Shall I shoot, my lord?" Long Tom asked. "They are some 250 yards away, but from this height methinks I could reach them." "It would be useless," Sir Eustace said. "You could hit them, I doubt not, but you would not pierce their armour at this distance, and it is as well that they should not know how far our bows will carry until we are sure of doing execution when we shoot. Besides, I would rather that they began the fight. The quarrel is not one of my seeking, and I will leave it to them to open the ball. It is true that they did so last night by sending their spies here, but we have balanced that account. Moreover, if they are to attack, the sooner the better. They may have gained news from Sir Hugh of the coming here of the English archers and the men at arms, but if they have not done so, we shall have a rare surprise in store for them." After the knights had made a circuit of the castle they retired, and presently a dense mass of men appeared from behind the brow on which the cottages they had burned had stood. "They have bundles of faggots, Sir Eustace!" Guy exclaimed. "So they have, Guy. Your eye is a good one. It seems to me that the outline was a strange one, but doubtless it is as you say, that each man has a faggot on his shoulder. It is evident that they intend in the first place to assault the postern, and have brought the faggots to fill up the ditch." Then he turned to the gunners at the cannon. "Lay your pieces so as to bear on them when they come halfway down the hill," said Sir Eustace, "and shoot when they are fairly in the line of fire." Take the same orders, Guy, to the men working the ballistas and mangonels on the wall. Tell them not to loose their machines until after the guns are fired. If the fellows take to flight, tell them not to waste their missiles. If they advance, let them be sure that they are well within range before they shoot." With loud shouts the enemy came down the slope. When they were halfway down, the two guns roared out, and their shot ploughed 2 lanes in the crowded body. There was a movement of retreat, but the 3 knights and several others threw themselves in front, waving their swords and shouting, and the Orleanists rallied and moved forward, but at a much slower pace than before. They had gone but a short distance when the arrows of the archers in the outwork and the bolts of the crossbows worked by the men-at-arms there began to fall among them. So true was the aim of the archers that scarcely a shaft was wasted. At the distance at which they were shooting they did not aim at the knights, whose visors and coats of mail could not have been pierced, but shot at the commonalty, whose faces and throats were for the most part unprotected. Man after man fell, and the crossbow bolts also told heavily upon the crowd. They had come down but a short distance farther when Long Tom, and the archers with him on the wall, began to send their arrows thick and fast, and the machines hurled heavy stones with tremendous force among them. A moment later the French broke and fled up the slope again, leaving some 50 of their numbers stretched on the ground. The knights followed more slowly. When they reached the crest a group of them gathered around Sir Clugnet de Brabant. "By my faith," the latter said bitterly, "we have reckoned without our host, sir knights. We came to shear, but in good sooth we seem more likely to go back shorn. Truly those knaves shoot marvellously, scarce an arrow went astray." "As I mentioned to you, Sir Clugnet," Sir Hugh de Fruges said, "Sir Eustace brought with him from England 25 bowmen, and I heard tell from men who had seen them trying their skill at targets that they were in no wise inferior to those with whom we have before had to deal to our cost." "Truly you did so, Sir Hugh, but the matter made no impression upon my mind, except as a proof that the knight's inclinations were still with England, and that it were well that his castle were placed in better keeping. But in truth these fellows shoot marvellously, both for strength and trueness of aim. I marked as we came back that of the men we passed lying there, nigh all those who had been struck with arrows were hit in the face or throat, and yet the distance must have been over 150 yards. "I can answer for the force," one of the others said, "for a shaft struck me fairly on the chest and hurled me to the ground as if it had been the shock of a lance, and it is well my mail was of the best work of Milan, but nevertheless the arrow broke 2 of the links. If the distance had been shorter I doubt not that it would have slain me. Well, what shall we do next, gentlemen? For very shame we cannot with 8,000 men march away having accomplished nothing. The question is, where shall our next attack be delivered?" "Methinks," another knight said, "we deliver our attack too rashly. Had I known that there were English archers there I should have advised waiting until nightfall, and I think it would be best to do so now. If we take our fellows up while there is light they will suffer so much from the stings of these wasps that they will soon lose heart. The knaves shoot not only straight and strong, but they shoot so fast that though, as you say, there may be but 25 of them, the air seemed full of arrows, and had you told us that there were 200 archers shooting I should have thought the estimate a reasonable one." They stood for some time discussing the best method of attack, and as soon as they had settled upon it the men were told to scatter. Some were to go to the farmhouses and bring up any hides that might be stored there, and to fetch all the hurdles they could lay hands upon. A portion were to go to the woods and cut timber for making mantlets and cover, while 2,000 were to remain under arms in case the garrison should make a sortie. Within the castle all were in high spirits at the easy repulse of the first attack. "Sir Clugnet must have learned from Sir Hugh of my having English archers and men at arms here," Sir Eustace said to his lieutenant, and yet he advanced as carelessly and confidently as if he had been attacking a place defended only by fat Flemish burghers. "However, he has had his lesson, and as it is said he is a good knight he will doubtless profit by it, and we shall hear no more of him till after the sun has set. Run up to the top of the keep, Guy, and bring me back news what they are doing." In a few minutes the lad returned. "There are 2,000 or 3,000 of them, my lord, drawn up in a body beyond the crest. The rest of them are scattering in various directions." "Yes, that is as I expected," Sir Eustace remarked.
They have gone to prepare materials for a regular attack. It may be delivered tonight, or may be delayed for a day or two. However, we shall be ready for them. Jean Bouvard, do you go round the walls and tell all, save a few as sentries, to retire until the watchman blows his horn to warn us if they seem to be gathering for an attack. And do you, Long Tom, give the same orders to your archers. There's no use wasting the men's strength till the work begins in earnest. If Sir Clugnet is wise, he will march away at once. He would need heavy machines and cannon to make a breach in our walls, and even had he an abundance of them, it would take him some time to do so. If he tries again, you may be sure that it will be the work of Sir Hugh de Fruges, who has no doubt a lively interest in the matter. He is a clever fellow, and will no doubt do his best to work on the feelings of the other knights by representing that it would be disgraceful for so large a force to abandon the enterprise merely because a first hasty attack, delivered without preparation, had been repulsed. The fact that they have made so careful an examination of the castle would seem in itself to show that they intend to renew the attempt in another form if the first onset failed, and, moreover, the scattering of the force afterward, while the knights still remained with a large body here, points in the same direction. Guy, on descending from the keep, joined Sir Eustace and his wife in their apartments. "The lad has borne himself bravely," Sir Eustace said approvingly to his wife. "He was standing beside me when the first shot was bringing down the dust round our ears, and he neither started nor flinched, though in truth it was far from pleasant, especially as we had nothing to do but to look on. It may be next time we shall have sterner fighting, and I doubt not that he will bear himself well." "Could I not come up and carry your messages, father?" Henry asked. "I am not strong like Guy, but I could do that." "He is too young for it yet, Eustace," Dame Margaret broke in. "Nay, wife," the knight said gently, "the lad is not too young for such service. There will be little danger in it, for his head will not show over the battlements, and it is well that he should learn to hear without fear the whiz of an arrow, or the shock of a great stone from a ballista, the clash of arms and the shouting of men. As he says, he is not yet strong enough to bear arms, but he will learn to brace his nerves and show a bold front in danger. That is a lesson that cannot be learned too young. Yes, Henry, you shall be my messenger. If they try an assault tonight, you shall put on for the first time the steel cap and breastpiece I had made for you in England. There will be no danger of your being hit by a crossbow bolt or arrow, but there may be splinters or stone flying when a missile hits the battlement. Take no arms with you, only your dagger. They would be useless to you, and would hamper your movements in getting past the men on the wall, or in running up and down the steps leading to it. Now you had better lie down. Both Guy and myself are going to do so. At sunset, if no alarm comes before, you will be called." "We must not coddle the boy, Margaret," he said, as Guy and Henry went off. "I know that he is not physically strong as yet, and sorry I am that it should be so, but he might exert himself more than he does, and he is apt to think too much of his ailments. I was glad when he volunteered to do something, for it is at least as well that he should be able to stand fire, even if he cannot learn the use of arms. Moreover, it may be that after once bearing a part in a fray, he may incline more warmly to warlike exercises than he has hitherto done. It may rouse in him a spirit which has so far been wanting. I have often thought that it would have been better if Agnes had been the boy and he the girl. She has far more courage and fire than he has. You remember when that savage bull chased them, how she saw him first over the stile, and got tossed over after him for her pains?" Dame Margaret nodded. "I am not likely to forget it, Eustace, seeing that her arm was broken and I had to nurse her for 6 weeks. Do you know that she was up on the top of the keep while the fighting was going on? Of course I was there myself, and she begged so hard to be allowed to remain with me that I had not the heart to say her nay." "Ah, was Henry there too?" "Oh yes, and shouted with the best of them when the enemy fled over the hill. Even Charlie was there, as excited as either of them. Of course I had to hold him up sometimes for him to be able to see what was going on, and he looked rather pale at first when they opened fire, but he soon plucked up when he saw that their shot did no damage near us. You see, he is a strong healthy boy, while Henry has always been weak, although I do not think that he lacks courage." "He ought not, wife. He comes from a fighting stock on either side."
but I fear that unless he changes greatly he is cut out rather for a monk than a man at arms. And now I will lie down, for you may be sure I shall not close an eye tonight. Did you note the banner of Hugh de Fruges with the others?" "Yes, and I felt more uncomfortable after seeing it. He is a crafty man, Eustace." "He is not a brave one," the knight said scornfully. "I challenged him to meet me outside in a fair field, and the craven did not answer me, and Sir Clugnet had to make speech for him and decline the offer." "You will need all your vigilance, Eustace. I trust that every man within the walls is faithful to you, but if there be a traitor, be sure that Sir Hugh will endeavour to plot with him, nay, he may already have done so." "They would have no chance of making communication with him, were there a dozen of them, wife. Long Tom and his comrades will take good care that none come near enough for speech." The day passed away in perfect quiet. From time to time word came down from the lookout that the scattered soldiers were returning, laden with a great quantity of young trees, wattles, and doors. Dame Margaret kept watch in her room and allowed no messengers to enter her husband's apartments. "If there be need I will wake him," she said, "but he knows well enough what the French have gone for, and there is naught to do until they advance to the attack." Guy slept but a short time, and as he frequently started up under the impression that the horn was sounding an alarm, in the afternoon he got up and went down into the courtyard. For some time he wandered about in the quarters occupied by the tenants. These had now settled down. The children were playing about as unconcernedly as if they had been on their fathers' farms. Women were washing clothes or preparing the evening meal over little charcoal fires. A certain quantity of meat had been served out to each family, and they were therefore doing better than in their own houses, for meat was a luxury seldom touched by the French peasantry. Almost all who had entered the castle had brought with them a supply of herbs and vegetables. These, with a handful or two of coarsely ground meal boiled in a broth, constituted their usual fare, and the addition of a portion of meat afforded them great satisfaction. Some of the men were still asleep in preparation for a long night's work, others were standing about talking in little groups, some were on the walls watching with gloomy faces the smoke wreaths that still rose from what had been their homes. Ducks, geese, and hens walked about unconcernedly, looking for any stray grains that had passed unnoticed when they had last been fed, and a chorus of dissatisfied grunting arose from the pigs that had a large pen in the yard next to the huts. These were still smarting under a sense of injury excited not only by their removal from their familiar haunts, but by the fact that most of them had been hastily marked by a clipping of some kind in the ear in order to enable their owners to distinguish them from the others. Boys were carrying buckets of water from a well in the courtyard to the troughs for the cattle and horses, and the men-at-arms were cleaning their armour and polishing their steel caps. "Well, Tom, I hope we shall get on as well tonight as we did this morning," Guy said to the leader of the archers. "I hope so, Master Guy, but I rather fight by day than by night. It's random work when you can neither see or mark to look straight along your arrow. If we had a moon we should do well enough, but on these dark nights skill does not go for much. Still, I doubt not that we shall give a good account of ourselves, for at any rate we shall be able to make them out before they come to close work. The women have been making a great store of torches today, and that will help us a bit, though I would that they could be planted 50 yards beyond the moat instead of on the walls, for although they will be of some use to us, they will be of more use even to the enemy. What think you that their plan will be?" "I should say that they are intending to march forward covered by mantlets of wattles and hides. They will plant them near the edge of the moat and throw up some earthworks to shelter them and their machines. No doubt they will use the doors they have fetched from all the farmhouses for the same purpose." "The doors will be more to the point, certainly," the bowman said. "As to their hides and wattles at 50 yards, I will warrant our arrows go through them as if they were paper, but I cannot say as much about stout oaken doors. That is a target that I have never shot against. I fear that the shock would shiver the shafts. The mantlets, too, would serve them to some purpose, for we should not know exactly where they were standing behind them. As for their machines, they cannot have many of them." "They had something like a score of waggons with them, Tom. These would carry the beams for half a dozen big ballistas. Besides, they have their cannon." "I don't make much account of the cannon," the archer said. "They take pretty nearly an hour to load and fire them, and at that rate, however hard a shot may hit, it would be some time before they wrought much damage on the walls. It's the sound more than the danger that makes men afraid of the things, and for my part I would not take the trouble of dragging them about. They are all very well on the walls of the castle, though I see not that even there they are of great advantage over the old machines. It's true that they shoot further, but that's of no great use. It's when the enemy come to attack that you want to kill them, and at 50 yards I would kill more men with my shafts in 10 minutes than a cannon would do with a week's firing. I wonder they trouble to carry them about with them, save that folks are not accustomed to their noise yet, and might open their gates when they see them, while they would make a stout defence if they had only ballistas and mangonels to deal with. I suppose when they have got the shelters close to the moat they will bring up planks to throw across." "Yes, no doubt they will try that, Tom, but the moat is over wide for planks, and I think it more likely that they will have provided themselves with sacks and fill them with earth, so as to make a passage across with them." "Well, as to the planks not being long enough, Master Guy, they could get over that easy enough. They would only have to send 3 or 4 swimmers across the moat, then thrust long beams over for those who had crossed to fix firmly, and then lay short planks across them." "Aye, so they would, Tom. I did not think of that. Well, at any rate, I expect they will manage to get across the moat somehow, and plant ladders against the wall." "And we shall chuck them down again," Tom said. "They won't care much for that, but as long as they cannot knock a breach in the walls I warrant that we can hold them.